So the prayer that we have prayed confronts us squarely with the message at the heart of what Amos was saying. You remember that we saw last week that prophets claim that the word of the Lord comes to them. They say regularly in their speeches, "Thus says the Lord." They engage in symbolic activities, underlining the message delivered by their words. And we can well imagine Amos, when he's talking about his vision of the plumb line, actually having one to show people. Woe to you is often how they introduce their oracles. And adherence to the covenant of the Lord lies underneath all that the prophets say. So we might like to think about those, have those things in mind as we look at the prophet Isaiah. We know that Amos, according to the first verse of his book, came from Tekoa in the southern kingdom, but his prophecies are in the northern kingdom during the reign of Jeroboam II. He was the 13th king of Israel, and he reigned for 40 years, a nice, good biblical number.
It is, isn't it?
Estimate it to be around 786 to 746. It was for the Northern Kingdom a time of prosperity. They had grapes and olives that were made into wine and olive oil for trade with both the neighboring nation of Assyria to the north and also Egypt to the south and west of Judah. But although it was a time of prosperity, it was also a time of sinfulness. And in fact, Amos notes that there are various religious sites in the Northern Kingdom, but he criticizes the way in which the people of Israel conducted their religion. And in fact, he refers to images made in worship in chapter 5, verse 26. And we know that according to many of the books of the Bible that come from the Southern Kingdom originally, that the use of images was forbidden, although again and again those books report that that was happening in worship. So Amos is trenchant in his criticism of people's worship, and he is also critical of the way that society operates. So we're going to watch the Bible Project video.
The book of the prophet Amos. Amos was a shepherd and a fig tree farmer who lived right near the border between northern Israel and southern Judah. Now, the north had seized its independence about 150 years earlier, remember 1 Kings chapter 12, and it was currently being ruled by Jeroboam II, a successful military leader. He won lots of battles and new territory for Israel, and he generated lots of wealth. But in the eyes of the prophets, he was one of the worst kings ever. His wealth had led to apathy, and he allowed idol worship for the gods of Canaan, which in turn led to injustice and the neglect of the poor. And it got to the point where Amos couldn't take it anymore. He sensed God calling him to go trek up north to Bethel, an important city that had a large temple, and start announcing God's word to the people. And this book is a collection of his sermons and poems and visions uttered over the years. They were compiled later to give God's people a sense of his divine message to the northern kingdom, and it's a message we still need to hear today. The book has a fairly clear design. Chapters 1 and 2 are a series of messages to the nations and Israel. Then chapters 3 to 6 are a collection of poems that express Amos's message to the people of Israel and its leaders. Chapters 7 through 9 contain a series of visions that Amos experienced that depict God's coming judgment on Israel. Let's just dive in. So the book opens with a series of short poems that accuse all of Israel's neighbors of violence and injustice. And this is kind of odd because the book's opening line said that Amos was going to speak against Israel. But watch how this works. As Amos is naming all of these neighboring nations, you can go look at a map and see that he's creating a circle. And when he's done, Israel lies right in the center, like a target in the crosshairs. And on Israel, Amos unleashes a poetic accusation that's 3 times longer and more intense than any of these others. He accuses Israel's wealthy of ignoring the poor and allowing grave injustice in their land, specifically by allowing the poor to be sold into debt slavery and then going on to deny any of these people legal representation. And this Amos asks. Is this the family that was once denied justice and enslaved in Egypt? The family that God rescued from oppression and slavery? The party's over, Amos says. God is done putting up with you. And so the opening of the next section explains why. God says, I chose you, Israel, from among all the families of the earth. This is an allusion to Genesis 12, how God had called the family of Abraham to become God's blessing to all of the nations. And so then God says, so this is why I will punish you for all of your sin. Israel had a great calling, which came with great responsibility, and so their sin and rebellion brings great consequences. Now, this section brings together a lot of Amos's poems, and you'll see a few key themes repeated over and over. So first, he's constantly exposing the religious hypocrisy of Israel's wealthy and their leaders, and he describes how they faithfully attend the religious gatherings, giving offerings and sacrifices, all the while neglecting the poor and ignoring injustice. And Amos says it's all a sham, that God actually hates their worship because it's totally disconnected from how they treat people. God says a real relationship with him will transform a person's relationships. And so Amos's call to true worship is to let justice flow like a river and righteousness like a never-failing stream. Now, these two words, they're super important for Amos and actually all of the prophets. So righteousness, or in Hebrew, tzedakah, refers to a standard of right, equitable relationships between people, no matter their social differences. And justice, or in Hebrew, mishpat, refers to concrete actions that you take to correct injustice and create righteousness. And so both of these are to permeate the life of God's covenant people like a rushing stream fills a dry riverbed. The next theme is Amos's repeated accusations of Israel's idolatry. So remember, when the northern kingdom broke away from southern Judah, their king built 2 new temples to rival Solomon's in Jerusalem, and he placed a golden calf in each. Remember 1 Kings chapter 12. Since then, Israel had only accumulated more idols, worshiping the gods of sex and weather and war. And in the prophet's view, the worship of these gods always led to injustice, because these gods don't require the same degree of justice and righteousness as the God of Israel, not to mention that these gods were immoral themselves. Not the God of Israel, he's different. So he can say in one place, seek me that you may live. And then right after that say to Israel, seek good, not evil, that you may live. So true worship of the Creator God of Israel, it's synonymous with doing good, with generosity, and with justice. And so the final theme in these chapters is that because Israel and its king have rejected Amos and the other prophets, God will send the day of the Lord. This is a great and terrible act of justice on Israel. And specifically, Amos predicts that a powerful nation will come and conquer and decimate their cities and take the people away into exile. And we know his prediction came true. Some 40 years later, the Assyrian Empire swooped in and did exactly as Amos had said. The book closes with a series of visions that Amos experienced, and they're symbolic depictions of the coming day of the Lord. So he sees Israel devastated by a locust swarm, and then by a scorching fire, and then they're being swallowed up like overripe fruit. And in the final vision, Amos sees God violently striking the pillars of Israel's great idol temple at Bethel, and the whole building comes crumbling down. It's an image of God's justice on the leaders and the gods of Israel. Their end has finally come. But then, all of a sudden, in the final paragraph, we see a glimmer of hope. It picks up this image of Israel as a destroyed building, and God says that out of the ruins, he will one day restore the house of David. In other words, he's going to bring the future Messianic king from David's line, and he will rebuild the family of God's people, which, surprisingly, we're told, is going to include people from all of the nations. All of the devastation caused by Israel's sin and God's judgment will that day be reversed. Now, this final paragraph is super important. It's the only sign of hope on the other side of judgment. And it helps us see how this book is exploring the relationship between God's justice and his mercy. If God is good, he has to confront and judge evil among Israel and the nations. But his long-term purposes are to restore his world and build a new covenant family. And so through Amos's words, we still today hear his call to learn from Israel's hypocrisy and disaster and to embrace a true worship of this God, which should always lead to justice and righteousness and loving our neighbor. And that's what the book of Amos is all about.
So that's the overview of the book of Amos, and hopefully some of you have read it through to see all of that. So we're going to explore a number of the issues that are raised in this book one by one. And the first of them, okay, you've got the map in your material that was sent to you. And we note that the first two chapters of this book are a series of oracles against the nations that surround Israel and Judah. And as the Bible Project video says, it's kind of tracks around until eventually comes to Israel as the bullseye. We thought that in groups we could talk about what's the effect of this arrangement of oracles at the start of the book. The videos, in a sense, started to answer that question. But also a question that's quite pertinent to the modern world. What right does a person of one nation have to criticize the actions of another nation? So you can talk about the literary structure of the book to start off with, and how that might give power to the message of Amos. And then also that question that resonates with us today. What right do we have in this nation to criticize the actions of another nation? So Elizabeth will put people into groups.
And welcome back, everyone. We're going to concentrate on the second question. What right does a person of one nation have to criticise the actions of another nation? And we'll take a few comments from your groups about that. Did you talk about that? And if you did, what insights would you like to share?
Well, my sense is that Amos felt a sense of authority under God, not from his nation. It wasn't as if he was speaking on behalf of Judah or anything like that. He had a sense of something much bigger that was authorizing him to say what he said.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a fair summary of how Amos sees things.
We have a situation like that right here in the South Pacific.
Yes, we do.
We are led by our politicians who are hopefully trying to protect us, but we do have a problem, and it's emerging.
Yeah. Yes, there's a lot of criticising at the moment of China in particular, which is probably what you're referring to. And yes, China's doing a lot of criticising of its own. So when you start criticising, you can end up with some messy situations.
I was going to say, one of the issues that I think we're all finding is that the church, to a large extent, or Christianity to a large extent, has lost its integrity. And so any voice that's raised in the name of God, in inverted commas, is not really being listened to by the wider sphere, the wider world, or even some parts of the church. We have a dilemma about who has the voice of God at the moment.
Yes. And often people who are not connected with churches see two types of church in front of them. They see Hillsong and they see the Catholic Church with all this sexual abuse of children. And that's what they see.
Or you take the abortion issue. There's another one where there's a huge divide, or treatment of, addictions. And that's just patching the top of the iceberg.
Yeah.
Yes, that's right. And I think you make a valid point. We're not at the centre anymore, and we've lost that right to raise our voice in the same way.
Well, we can raise it, but no one's interested.
Well, no, not unless it's controversial. And then they might cover it.
And they just remind us of what the church has done.
So, perhaps when we do try to raise it, we don't raise it with insight that grabs. Perhaps if we were able to raise some of these issues in a way that is hard to refute, well, then that would immediately give us an immediate authority.
It depends on the media too, and the media operates in a different way now.
Unless it's controversial, they're not interested.
Pretty much. And that's helped tar the church with the same brush. So that's been an issue. All right, we'll move on. We're looking at do justice and seeking righteousness in your material with a very nice snapshot of Amos underneath it.
Wow, it's really been working out.
Yes, he has. He's got some biceps there, hasn't he? Yes. I mean, it's all that shepherding, Steve, picking up those lambs and throwing them over his shoulder.
Must be.
So we know that the perpetration of social inequity is what causes Amos to get most angry and why he says God is not happy. And there's some particular verses that you might want to look at for these, and the way the rich mistreat the poor. So they sell the righteous for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals. They who trample the head of the poor into the dust of the earth and push the afflicted out of the way. So the picture being painted here is that the poor and the needy, and probably those who are working in very menial tasks, would be seen by the rich are being given a very hard time. And again, we have in chapter 5, you trample on the poor and take from them the levies of grain. So even the things they're entitled to, the rich are robbing them of. And then we have this criticism of the cows of Bashan, which was probably some sort of breed of cow that was fat and sleek. But here it's a very derogatory term because it's referring to wealthy women. And Amos criticises them, deploring their winter and summer houses. Does that remind you of anything? And their houses of ivory, and they're really big houses. And he suggests that luxury and opulence are being lived out in these houses in a really indulgent way, while others are desperately poor. And he castigates such extravagance. So we've got 2 questions for you to think about in your groups, and we'd better give you a bit more time, I think. What do the oracles of Amos tell us about the situation of the people? So what do these verses convey about the social status and how is society constructed in Israel at the moment? And how might you relate that situation to the world we live in today? So that should give you plenty to talk about, I am thinking. So I'll just give you a few more minutes so you don't run out of time quite as quickly. Okay, how did you go with that question that we sat to you about the situation of the people? Let's take that first. What sort of society are we looking at here? One like our own, yes? Do you want to unpack that, Margaret?
One.
What was that, Steve?
An unequal one.
It's an unequal one.
We were looking very much at the inequality that and the gap that now has developed, where nearly all the wealth of the world is held by about 4 or 5 people, and that those who have very little are being held in that position because of the very unequal distribution of wealth and power.
Yes.
Yeah.
And even in our own country, we have now people living below the poverty line who are homeless, who are in cars, and in a wealthy nation like Australia, that's terrible. And then when we move into the developing world, into the continent of Asia and Africa and South America, we find people living on less than $2 a day.
Yeah. It's a bit too as if money is what ultimately gives people authority. I mean, even governmental authority is being eclipsed by money.
Well, you can buy governments.
Yes.
And literally buy them if you give them enough money and donations and perks and things.
Absolutely.
They'll do what you want. Yeah.
And vice versa, governments buy votes by offering, offering to do things for communities. So it's not much different.
Or tax cuts.
Or tax cuts
by
or
offering
whatever.
tax cuts, that's another way of getting people to try and getting people to vote for you.
Building
So
on
do you think,
floodplains.
what was that, Margot?
Building on floodplains. Councils,
That's right.
the money trickles right through government.
Yes, developers who wish to build in places they should not build. And developers have actually sued councils for trying to stop them.
Yes.
So when you think of blaming your local council, it may not be them. It may be the developers that sued them. Lake Macquarie Council was sued for trying to stop people building where they knew climate change and water would affect them.
Good heavens. The whole country's corrupt.
That's right. And it's more dire in some other situations in the world where we have people who are under bond slavery to build certain things because they can't pay their debts. And we have people working in sweatshops and working in fields for $2 a day, and they live in dire poverty. And the rich in that case is the Western world because they're working to make goods that we think we need.
Yes.
And don't want to pay a fair price for.
Right.
So it's
Yes,
a situation that is not unique to Amos. It would seem this situation Amos is describing, it was ever thus in a way, is it not?
Yes, so that's what, yeah. It
Yeah,
seems as
sometimes-
though it is. Oh, go on, Jerry, go on.
Sometimes we think, sometimes we think we are just a salesman, farmer, or housewife. Amos will be considered as just a. I think so.
Yeah.
And he wasn't a prophet. He wasn't a prophet or a priest or the son of either. And he wasn't an educated person. He was just a shepherd, a small businessman in Judah who listened to him, nobody. But instead of making excuses, Amos obeyed and become God's powerful voice of change.
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's right. He is. And he's come from quite humble beginnings, hasn't he? As Jerry said, he was a shepherd.
Yes, and God had used ordinary people like this. God had used ordinary people such as shepherds, carpenters, and fishermen, all through the Bible.
Yes, he does.
Whatever we are in life, God can use us.
Yes.
Amos wasn't much. He was just it. He was just a servant of God. It's good to be. It is good to be God just a. Yeah.
That's right. Amos is also, he's a servant of God. He's an ordinary person. He's come from a fairly humble kind of profession as a sheep herder, and God has raised him up to speak these words to the rich. And Jerry's right. You don't usually get a rich person being raised up speaking oracles of God. They tend to be fairly ordinary people. And if they started rich, they've generally renounced all their wealth and they're roaming around the countryside in an itinerant lifestyle.
Like Francis.
Yeah,
That's
I was
like
thinking of
Francis. That's right. So this is a fairly typical kind of picture of most of the prophets that we get. There are some exceptions. Ezekiel was a priest, so we can assume he wasn't starving. And there's some others, but it's common for them to come from the level of society that is probably suffering from this kind of wealth differential and oppression. So they're speaking for the voice of the people who are on the other side of the wealth divide, if you like. We've kind of lost that now, I'd suggest, in our modern world. Did anyone talk about that?
No, but I think we didn't talk about it, but I think in time, and if we look back over time, there have been those who have stepped up and spoken up and have become leaders. We had not, I'm not aware of any now, and I stand to be corrected. We get too many voices calling out at the one time in opposition to each other, or whether we have a spokesperson for change. I'm not so sure. Greta tried to be with climate change.
Yeah. Rosie Batty with domestic violence is another one.
That's right. Yes.
Tim Costello was a
Yes.
great voice for the poor. Speaking out was another one I can think of. So there's a number of people that have spoken out in our world. The Pope often speaks out.
Often, yes.
Talking about the poor and how the poor are treated. So those voices are there, but they don't have quite the impact nowadays, I don't think.
No.
So,
Elizabeth, I was just thinking, I've been reflecting on the prophets generally, but on Amos in particular. Like, it's not as if they were ordained. You know, there wasn't a service where everyone says, "Oh, so now he's a prophet." You know, like, there's something about force of personality and call of God on their heart that, you know, and then they're sort of, as you've already pointed out, the visions and the images that they use that are somehow able to sort of grab a hold of people. They must have been incredible personalities in one sense. I mean, obviously God's Spirit was working in them, but there must have been an amazing personality that have that force. You know, in a sort of a society, they can't hop on social media. You know, what do they do? I suppose that all they could do is go to the city gate or something like that and announce these words. And
Yes.
you know, perhaps 90% of people just would have forgotten them, but there's something in them that is able to, and you know, so they must, what they say must resonate with people as well.
Well,
It's
it
a
does.
different
It's
society.
interesting, and interestingly, it is often in hindsight that the validity of their words ring out. It's like looking at Amos now, all these years later, and seeing how true those comments of his were in relation to the state of society then as it is now. And where is God in all this?
That's a good question. Where is God in all this? Welcome, Toby.
We tend to kill the prophets and then build monuments to them later.
Yes.
Yes, that's right. And if we don't murder prophets now, we treat them as angry people who should be just hustled out of the boardroom and not listened to.
They're embarrassing.
They are embarrassing. And we don't put them on any boards and any committees in the synod in case they say something that's way out of line, and we treat them like wild cards. And I speak from experience here.
Or move them on.
Or move them on somewhere else. That's right.
Happened in South Australia.
Yes.
That's right.
I'm just wondering about the alternative and thinking of groups like Moral Rearmament who tried to affect change amongst people in authority and power, but do so by trying to get alongside, not by being a prophet and hurling grenades.
Yeah. And the Micah
they're
project.
Not particularly successful either. Huh.
Yeah.
And perhaps that's the good point to think about, that God doesn't stand still. So whichever way is going to be the way at the time, it will be applicable to the time. So for for Amos, who didn't have the kind of communications that we have, standing on the street's corner was the best way to get the message across. We have other ways now, and they are the ways that will be used to get the message across.
Yep, that's right. Because the street corner and standing at the crossroads, we know from Proverbs, where we look at Lady Wisdom and where she is doing all her shouting, is obviously where these things took place.
Yeah.
So if you were standing as a male, particularly at the town gates, you would, and you had a compelling personality, you would command a lot of power in a sense. Because if Amos didn't have power, they wouldn't be trying to send him back home. So he obviously was a very charismatic, forceful kind of speaker, and he was being listened to, and what he was saying was not resonating with them because they didn't want to hear it. Okay.
So Amos says that God has pleaded with the people to turn, to repent, to come back, seek me and live. Seek good and not evil that you may live. And in chapter 4, he outlines a whole lot of ways that God has punished the people, trying to get them to repent. I gave you cleanness of teeth and lack of bread. Had clean teeth because there was no food to eat. Yet you did not return to me, and I withheld the rain from you when there was still 3 months to the harvest. And then I sent rain on one city and not on another city, and you did not return to me. And then I struck you with blight and mildew and laid waste to your gardens and vineyards, and locusts devoured your fig trees and olive trees, yet you did not return to me. And I sent a pestilence. I killed your young men with the sword, carried away your horses, made the stench of your camp go up into your nostrils. Isn't this dramatic, vivid, graphic imagery? Yet you did not return to me. I overthrew some of you as when God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah. Yet you did not return to me. Therefore, thus I will do. I love the prophets because you can really get on your high horse, can't you? Therefore, thus I will do to you, O Israel. Prepare to meet your God, O Israel. And from this comes the declaration of the day of darkness, not light, day of gloom with no brightness in it. And Amos.
So is this a fair interpretation that Amos is indulging in?
a fair interpretation
Yes.
Really
I mean,
was up
what God's really like.
of, well, that, I mean, that's one of the issues that runs right through all of the prophets, the way
It is, yes.
God.
So,
That's right.
Is this how we understand God? Yes.
yes. So I've had outrageous thought the whole idea of karma might be
Right.
people now.
Yes.
Yes, though you'll find by the New Testament, karma has moved from punishment like this into punishment in the afterlife. So it
Yes.
shifts. Here,
Yes.
Amos is talking about what's going to happen to you now in your lifetime. He's
Yes.
not talking about you going to hell or being punished in an afterlife. So
this is Amos's image of God. He says in the beginning of his first oracle that the Lord roars from Zion. And then in chapter 3, he says, since the lion has roared, who will not fear? The Lord God has spoken, who can but prophesy? And that's his impetus for being a prophet, his sense that the Lord has roared like a lion. And then he talks about a series of visions in which he sees God bringing to fruition this promise. The great house shall be shattered to bits, the little house into pieces, dead bodies shall be many, cast out into every place. So there's a series of visions in which God's judgment is implemented. There's the plague, the shower of fire, the plumb line, the basket of summer fruit, and we have two of these visions in our lectionary offerings for last Sunday and this Sunday. And whilst after the earlier visions, Amos intercedes on behalf of the people, Lord God, forgive, I beg you, cease, I beg you. And God does relent and says it shall not be. But with the following visions, God is resolute, and he states God's definitive judgment that those who are left I will kill with the sword. Not one of them shall flee away. Not one of them shall escape. So there's some really important questions here about our faith and about the God in whom we have faith. What do you think the effect might have been of these oracles of judgment on those who heard them from Amos? You might like to ponder, is this an effective way to generate a change of behaviour in people?
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, it didn't work, did it?
And what does it say, David's question about what does it say about what God is like? Is this how we understand and experience God? And then there's another question here. What do the criticisms of Amos say to people who maintain that religion is a private matter and it has no role in the public arena? So there's a whole host of things that are raised by this. And do not despair, because prophet after prophet after prophet grapple with the same issues. So we'll come back to these questions. It doesn't matter if we don't deal with them all today, but back into groups to have a fair go at whatever your group wants to look at from that swag of questions. Okay.
Those who are interested in other nations, there's just been a kind of the Solomon's PM has ruled out a China military base, calling Australia a security partner of choice. How about that?
Well, that's helpful.
Okay, back to Amos. So what do you think of the effect these oracles of judgment might have had on those who heard them? And does that generate a change of behaviour, do you think?
They need a lesson in psychology because it doesn't work.
It doesn't work.
Gives God a bad name.
Yes.
It might have worked in the ancient world, though there doesn't seem to be a lot of evidence of that.
No.
But it certainly doesn't work in our world. I can just imagine Otto and Steve and myself or Margaret getting up and saying to a congregation, or Sandy saying, right then, you will do this.
And if you don't, this is what will happen.
Yes, locusts will rain down on you, and the sky will rain fishes upon you. I don't think we'd be taken very seriously, and I think we'd be found rather irritating.
We might be even worse. We might have people come and talk to us and say, "Are you okay?"
I prefer Jesus' method. Love God and love your neighbour.
The point remains, though, that justice is centrally important.
Oh, absolutely.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
It's
Justice
not
is
the
central.
message. It's not the message. It's the method.
Yep. Yep. I suspect when we read these texts, we probably think, go Amos. That's right. Preach it, brother. You know, justice is a good thing. Defend the poor. I suspect we read these texts like that. But I also suspect if Amos fronted up in our congregations and said exactly the same thing to us or something very similar, we probably wouldn't take it quite so well.
Yeah, you're probably right. Because when you're reading something or watching like the video we watched, it's a very different thing to actually hearing it spoken by someone.
And spoken at you.
Well, yeah, at you.
At you, rather than reading about it being spoken to someone else where you can say, yeah, you know, you deserve it.
Of course.
You wealthy women exploiting all those poor slaves, you know. Yeah, get them, Amos. But if Amos was saying, you wealthy church people who are wearing sweatshop clothes, stop it immediately, I don't think we'd take it so well.
No.
They're going, oh, he's talking about everybody else but me.
Exactly.
Yes, I don't do that, do I?
And if I do that, I can find rationales for it. Well, they need work. It's better they're in a sweatshop than not working at all. We can always find a rationale for it.
Yes.
So we're good at that. What about the criticisms Amos say to the people who maintain religion is a private matter? So when we read Amos, he's very public about his criticism of king and wealthy. Is religion private in this book of Amos?
No.
No, it's not. It's a very communal thing.
Public.
It is a public thing. So what about people nowadays who keep saying religion should stay out of this, it should stay out of that?
But they don't understand what religion is.
Well, they probably don't. They've probably never set foot in a church. But then again, there's a lot of very conservative people who would say you shouldn't mix it up with government either, and then proceed to buy governments to get them to do what they want.
Or storm the White House.
Yes, yes.
Well, a perfect example of how it's really hard to get scripture into schools now. It's like you get your whole hour a week, or if you're lucky, you know, it's a battle to really keep it in the schools. So it's like, you know, religion doesn't belong here. This is a public school, or, you know, it's in lots of areas of society.
And down here, they split it off from ethics. You've got to choose either ethics or religion.
Yeah. It's like you are, like they're not
like they're not separate.
Well, they actually are very separate in schools.
That's very narrow-minded, because religion and ethics are the same thing.
Well, they're not as they're taught in schools. Let me be clear about this. I've taught ethics and I've taught scripture. And the people increasingly doing scripture in schools are very fundamentalist. So what they're teaching is this very literalist point of view that if you don't believe, you'll go to hell. And this is what the stories literally say, where ethics teaches children to think critically. And I'll tell you now, I don't know a single scripture class that I've been in, other than my own, that taught children to think critically.
No.
Mine.
Yours, Steve. So that's Steve and I and David's. Right, there's three of us. But there's not.
Oh, well, there's hope yet.
There might be. There's not many. Mostly they go in and talk about content and stories with a moral punchline. That's what happens in scripture. What happens in ethics is dilemmas are presented to children about lying or stealing, and they say, all right, what would you do in this situation? What are all the things you need to consider in this situation? So where we think as adults, there should be religion and ethics should be the same. And of course, religion has ethics. I can tell you now, as they're taught in primary schools, they are not the same. They're very different.
And the book of Amos ends with a glorious promise for the future. And I can't wait to see that promise. Yeah.
That would be great, Jerry. I think we're all waiting to see that promise.
It said, I will plant Israel in their own land. never again to be uprooted from the land I have given them, says the Lord.
Yeah. And it is a great thing that God is promising there. But there's a lot of bad stuff before we quite get to that promise. John, do you want to pick that up now?
Yeah, so in the middle of talking about his visions, the priest of Bethel, which is one of the mountains on which there was a religious site, which Amos has had squarely in view, the priest of Bethel says, look, that's enough. You're a southerner. Go back home. He's not happy with the activity of the prophet. Although Amos was commanded by the priest to go back home, he doesn't. He responds, he says, well, I'm not really a prophet, which is a typical thing for a prophet to say. Not me. But then he reiterates his prophecy. He says, you'll die in an unclean land. Israel will go into exile. And now, in terms of foretelling and forthtelling, Amos is very much forthtelling to the people, but in the midst of that forthtelling, he makes this foretelling statement about Israel going into exile. And we know that a couple of decades after Amos, the Assyrian Empire conquered the north and took away the peoples into exile in Assyria. So that's a foretelling element in the midst of all of the forthtelling. And here is where Amos really expands the imagery of the day of the Lord. So Amos is one of the earliest of the minor and major prophets, and he is the one that first speaks this idea of the day of the Lord, which gets a life of its own in the prophets. It goes on and on through the prophets, through the exile of the north and the exile of the south, and then the return to the south. The prophets keep on talking about the day of the Lord. The sun will go down at noon and darken the earth with broad daylight. Beautiful young women and young men shall faint for thirst, for fall and never rise again. This really confronting statement in chapter 9, God says, I will fix my eyes on them for harm and not for good. The eyes of the Lord, says Amos, are on this sinful kingdom, and I will destroy it, says God, from the face of the earth. So maybe the question for us to think about now is, how do we understand this theme of the day of the Lord, which goes through, as your notes indicate, into the New Testament, is picked up by Paul and in 2 Peter, and Peter preaching on the day of Pentecost. How do we understand this theme in the 21st century? Is it still a theme that is relevant to us, that God is going to have this kind of cataclysmic intervention to bring harm on sinful people?
I think, oh yeah, good.
Yeah, I've done the rooms. Oh, you put something up. I've just sent them to their breakout rooms.
I forgot to put the slides up. I had a picture of the day of the Lord.
Do you think the day of the Lord is still relevant to us? What is this day of the Lord? How do you understand it?
Yeah, it's relevant because all what the Bible talk about, like we seeing it happening right now. Like it's in the eyes right now. We can see it at the door. We can see it. Like the war is in Ukraine, in Russia. Yeah. We can see it. So it's real. It's real. Even sickness all around. We can see the sickness all around, like coronavirus. Many people losing their lives from deadly disease. You know, even in Africa, we've been suffering from. In Africa, we was having Ebola. Yeah. I don't know if you heard about the Ebola virus. Yes. Yeah, it was in Africa. It was around here in Africa, and most Africans lose their lives from that deadly disease virus they call. It's called it's called Ebola.
Yes. And yes, we heard about Ebola.
Yeah.
And we have another one around here again. We seen a coronavirus again. So all those things that the Bible talk about that we're gonna see them, the end times is coming around. We seen them. So I believe we in the end time. I believe.
Well, there certainly is a lot of things that the prophets talk about that we can see nowadays, like disease, like famine, like wars. But I'd probably want to say that disease, famine, and wars can be found almost in any time in human history. So the question would be, why is this disease and this famine and these wars the ones that we would see as the day of the Lord rather than the Black Plague, for instance, in the Middle Ages? So that's a question that we have to keep before us. We probably are in end times in a sense, because if we don't do something about climate change, we're probably all doomed. And we're bringing it on ourselves. So the day of the Lord is going to end up, what are the effects of climate change? These floods, these fires, these droughts, these famines are all coming about because of our actions. So in a way, what Jerry is saying is quite pertinent.
Yeah.
Well, we also need to bring it back to the question of foretelling and forthtelling, I think, which is one of the themes that we'll run through, because this image emerges for Amos out of his forthtelling, out of his looking at the sinfulness of the nation, and it's very directed to Israel for what they have not been doing. And the imagery that is quite poetic and graphic and vivid is about punishing Israel. So he's not talking about the grand scheme that we get in other prophets about different empires and different times and different epochs and so on, which is what has fed the whole thing about the day of the Lord is the end times are in our time. That he's actually really predominantly forthtelling to his people, and part of that has an element of foretelling. And we know from history that and of course, anyone that's looking at their situation ought to be able to see this great empire Assyria. They've already made forays south.
We're going to get smashed.
They could see that it was going to happen, and indeed it did happen. So the foretelling is really not in terms of the next 2,000 or 3,000 years. The foretelling is in terms of the next decade or 2 decades arising out of the foretelling. I think that's a really important element
and that does gradually shift. I mean, by the New Testament, it's become something the whole world. The day of the Lord is going to be for the whole world. There'll be a judgment for all the nations. So by the New Testament, that's very clear. It's shifted from just being a judgment on Israel or on Judah, depending on the prophet.
Global,
it becomes global in the way that Jerry was describing. It becomes a global thing by the New Testament. Well, we should finish up. We've got a minute to finish up on a note of hope, John.
The very last oracle in Amos, and we will find this again and again in various prophets when we look at the structure of the whole book, that the last bit is, well, don't worry, in the end, God really loves you, God has mercy, God's going to sort it out. It won't be as bad as I promised. So there's that promise that Jerry mentioned before, right at the end. Not only will they come back into the land and they will plant their vineyards and they will have their fortunes restored. I will plant them upon their land and they shall never again be plucked up out of the land that I have given them, says the Lord your God. And that's one of the prophecies, of course, that has fueled the whole thing about the restoration of Israel in 1948 and the Zionist zeal that never again will Israel be completely a nation of exiles. At any rate, Amos wasn't talking about that. He was talking about hope that will come after the time of exile. Although I've said Amos wasn't saying that, and it's presented as Amos speaking, one of the really controversial, one of the most contested parts of the scholarly discussion of Amos, as indeed of other prophets, is, did Amos actually say this word of hope?
Yes.
Or was it added later on? Because we know that we don't have the books written at the time of the prophet being active. We don't have the scripture there, the scrolls. So these are written down later, and this Amos is collected into this collection of the 12 prophets. So was this a later edition? And then one of the things that feeds that is this is the first time in the whole of this book that David is mentioned. On that day, I will raise up the booth of David that is fallen. And David, of course, is a southerner. So what's Amos doing, talking to the northern kingdom about the booth of David, which is a southern thing? And anyway,
yes, of course.
There's controversy.
They wouldn't have liked that.
In the canonical version that we have, the book ends with a word of hope. And the question that we posed there, does this ending to the book undo everything that Amos was working towards? He's pressing against Israel again and again to repent. And if he says in the end, well, okay, God's going to sort it out, does that kind of dissolve that?
Contradict, yes. Yes.
Bear that question in mind, because we'll ask it again in other prophetic books as well.
Very, very good question.
Yep.
Yeah.
So your homework next week is the book of Hosea. He's a minor prophet, so he won't take you more than half an hour to read. And we ask you to have a read of Hosea and have a look at that. And you might think about how Hosea compares with Amos, and deepen your grasp on the prophetic literature, which you'll find follows formulas or follows a certain pattern when we look particularly at the minor prophets. And you might want to think about what Hosea's problems are. What is he talking about? And then there's two passages we'd like you to consider, 1 to 10 and 11, 1 to 11.
And
or next week.
They're the two passages that are set in the lectionary. So we'll be jumping into Hosea ahead of those.
Yeah. So thank you everyone for coming. If you would like to stay for Lectionary Cafe,